Frank Morrison had been avoiding his new neighbor for 3 months, ever since the moving truck had arrived next door. He'd seen enough during his brief glimpses: Vietnamese family, multiple generations, the smell of unfamiliar cooking drifting over the fence. Old prejudices died hard, even when you knew they were wrong. But when he heard the sobbing through the thin walls at 3 a.m., something made him knock on Mrs. Chen's door. The tiny woman who answered was clutching a faded photograph of a young soldier in ARVN uniform. "Today is the anniversary," she whispered. 46 years since they killed my husband." Frank stared at the photograph and realized that while he'd been running from Vietnamese people, this woman had been running from the same war. Welcome to ANZAC War Stories. Before we share this powerful tale of reconciliation, healing, and the unexpected bonds that can form between former enemies, tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you believe these stories of finding peace deserve to be heard, please subscribe. Sometimes the greatest victories happen long after the war ends. Frank Morrison had been avoiding his new neighbor for 3 months. Every glimpse of the elderly Vietnamese woman next door transported him back to rice paddies and jungle trails, to faces that might have been allies or enemies in a war he'd spent 50 years trying to forget. Margaret would have been ashamed of him. His late wife would have been over with a casserole within hours of the moving truck's departure. But Frank wasn't Margaret. He was a broken-down old soldier who still flinched at helicopter sounds and couldn't separate past from present when it came to Vietnamese faces. The irony cut deep. After 5 decades, one elderly woman in a suburban garden could still reduce him to a frightened 19-year-old. The crying started at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday in June. Frank knew the exact time because he'd been lying awake anyway, staring at the ceiling and listening to his old house settle around him. Insomnia was an old companion, another gift from the war that kept on giving. At first he thought it might be the wind or maybe the neighbor's cat, but as he lay there in the darkness, the sound resolved into something unmistakably human: the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose grief was too large for their body to contain. Frank sat up in bed, listening. The walls between the 1960s houses were thin, and sound carried easily between the bedrooms. It was definitely coming from next door, from what he'd assumed was Mrs. Chen's room based on the patterns of light he'd observed during his months of strategic avoidance. He should roll over and go back to sleep. It was none of his business. Whatever pain his neighbor was experiencing, Frank Morrison was the last person qualified to offer comfort. He had enough ghosts of his own to wrestle with. But the crying continued, raw and heartbroken, and something about it tugged at places in Frank's chest that he'd thought were permanently sealed off. It was the sound of someone drowning in memory, and Frank knew that particular ocean better than most. Before he could talk himself out of it, Frank was pulling on his dressing gown and slippers, moving through his dark house to the front door. The night air was crisp against his face as he stepped onto his front porch and looked at the house next door. A single light was on in what he'd guessed was Mrs. Chen's bedroom window. The crying was clearer now, mixed with words in Vietnamese that Frank couldn't understand but didn't need to. Grief was a universal language. Frank stood there for 5 minutes, arguing with himself. Walk away. Mind your own business. You're a 78-year-old man in your pajamas standing outside a stranger's house at 3 a.m. How does that look? But Margaret's voice was stronger than his fear. Frank Morrison, if someone's in pain and you can help, you help. Everything else is just excuses. Frank walked to Mrs. Chen's front door and knocked softly. The crying stopped immediately. Frank could hear movement inside, careful footsteps, the sound of someone trying to compose themselves. The porch light came on, and Frank heard the chain slide back. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Chen in a faded blue nightgown, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen with tears, and in her small hands she clutched a photograph. For a moment neither of them spoke. Frank found himself looking into the face of his former enemy, and seeing only a grieving woman who looked as lost as he felt most days. "I heard," Frank started, then stopped. What exactly had he heard? What was he doing here? Mrs. Chen studied his face with surprising intensity, taking in his military bearing, the way he held himself, the careful distance he maintained even while offering help. "You were there," she said quietly, her English accented but clear. "I can see it in your eyes." Frank's stomach tightened. "Ma'am, Vietnam, you were a soldier there." It wasn't a question. Frank nodded slowly. Mrs. Chen's grip tightened on the photograph. "Today is the anniversary," she whispered. 46 years since they killed my husband." She held up the photograph, and Frank found himself looking at a young man in an ARVN uniform, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese forces that had fought alongside the Americans and Australians. The soldier in the photo couldn't have been more than 25, with kind eyes and a slight smile that suggested the picture had been taken during a moment of rare peace. Frank stared at the photograph and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This wasn't the faceless enemy he'd been trained to fight. This was a widow mourning her husband, a woman who'd lost everything to the same war that had taken pieces of Frank's soul. "I'm sorry," Frank said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. Mrs. Chen studied his face again, then stepped back from the door. "Would you like some tea? I don't think either of us will sleep tonight." Mrs. Chen's kitchen was small and immaculate, decorated with the careful touches of someone who'd learned to make any space feel like home. Photos of children and grandchildren lined the windowsill, and the air carried the comforting sense of jasmine and something Frank couldn't identify, but that reminded him of the better moments from his time in country. She moved with economical grace, preparing tea with the precision of ritual. Frank sat at her small wooden table, still holding the photograph of her husband, feeling like he'd stumbled into someone else's dream. "His name was Lieutenant Duke Chen," she said as she set a steaming cup in front of him. "We were married 6 months before he was killed. I was 19. Frank looked at the photograph again, noting the insignia on the uniform, the careful way the young soldier had posed for what might have been his last formal portrait. "How did he—" Frank started, then stopped. In his experience, the details of how good men died in bad wars weren't always stories that brought comfort, but Mrs. Chen seemed to need to tell it. Mortar attack on Firebase Alpha, near Duc Huo, June 18, 1978. He was leading a patrol when the VC hit them with 122mm rounds. The Americans called for dust-off, but she shrugged, a gesture that somehow contained decades of grief. By the time the helicopters came, it was too late. Frank knew Firebase Alpha. The 7th Battalion had operated in that area, providing support for ARVN units like Lieutenant Chen's. It was possible, likely, even, that Frank had been in the same general region when this woman's husband died. "I'm sorry," Frank said again, setting the photograph gently on the table between them. "He looks like he was a good man." He was. Mrs. Chen's voice was soft but steady. He believed in what he was fighting for. Free Vietnam, democracy, a future for our children. He died believing that help was coming, that the Americans and Australians would never abandon us. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He'd been part of that abandonment, part of the withdrawal that had left people like Lieutenant Chen to face the final collapse alone. The guilt he'd carried for 50 years suddenly had a face, a name, a story. "After Saigon fell," Mrs. Chen continued, "I spent 3 years in a re-education camp. My crime was being married to an ARVN officer. When they released me, I had nothing. No family. My parents had died in the camps. No home. Our village had been relocated. No country that wanted people like me." She sipped her tea, her hands steady despite the weight of the memories she was sharing. "I tried to get on the boats 6 times. Each time something went wrong. Pirates, engine failure, overcrowding. The 7th time, I made it to Malaysia. Spent 2 years in the refugee camps before Australia accepted my application." Frank did the math in his head. She would have been in her late 20s by the time she reached Australia, a widow carrying nothing but grief and hope in equal measure. "Why Australia?" he asked. Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time since he'd knocked on her door. "Because Australian soldiers had fought beside my husband, because this country had been an ally, had made promises. I thought," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I thought maybe here, people would understand what we had lost." Frank felt something breaking open in his chest. Did they understand, I mean? Some did, some didn't. There was much anger about the war. Many people saw Vietnamese faces and remembered only the defeat, the boats, the cost. We learned to be grateful for tolerance, even when understanding was too much to ask for. They sat in silence for a moment, 2 old survivors of the same war, separated by language and nationality, but connected by something deeper than either had expected to find. "What about you?" Mrs. Chen asked quietly. "What did you bring home from Vietnam?" Frank thought about how to answer that question. What did you bring home from a war that nobody wanted to talk about, that had been lost before you'd even left, that had turned a generation of young men into walking wounded? "Nightmares," he said finally. "Guilt, a wife who loved me anyway and spent 30 years trying to heal what couldn't be healed. 3 medals I never wore, and a chest full of shrapnel that aches when it rains. And anger." Frank considered that. "For a long time, yes. At the politicians who sent us. At the protesters who spat on us when we came home. At the Vietnamese people who—" He stopped, looking at Mrs. Chen's patient face. "It was easier to be angry than to admit we'd failed." "You didn't fail," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You came when called. You fought beside my husband and men like him. You bled for a country that wasn't yours. The failure belonged to politicians and generals, not to soldiers who did their duty. Frank felt tears threatening for the first time in months. We left you behind. When the politics changed, when it became too expensive, too unpopular, we just left. Yes, Mrs. Chen said simply. You did, but staying would have meant more death, more young men like you and my husband dying for a war that was already lost. Sometimes the most merciful thing is knowing when to stop fighting. They talked until dawn, sharing stories that neither had told in years. Frank learned about Mrs. Chen's journey to Australia, her struggle to build a new life while carrying the weight of everything she'd lost. She learned about his battles with what was now called PTSD, his marriage to Margaret, his decades of trying to make sense of a war that had seemed to make no sense at all. As the sun came up over suburban Melbourne, Frank found himself looking at his neighbor with completely different eyes. She wasn't the enemy he'd been trained to see. She was a fellow survivor, someone who'd paid an even higher price for the same historical tragedy.
Owe you an apology,
Frank said as Mrs. Chen walked him to her front door. I've been avoiding you for 3 months, not because of anything you did, but
because I was still fighting a war that ended 50 years ago.
Mrs. Chen studied his face with those intelligent eyes. We all fight old wars, Mr. Morrison. Frank Morrison, Mrs. Chen, Lin Chen. She extended her small hand and Frank shook it gently. And you don't owe me an apology, Mr. Morrison. You owe yourself forgiveness. Frank walked back to his own house as the neighborhood began to wake up around them. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the need to hide from his neighbor's presence. For the first time in years, he felt something that might eventually become peace. Over the following weeks, Frank and Mrs. Chen developed an unlikely routine. Most evenings, Frank would find excuses to work in his front garden when Mrs. Chen took her walks. She'd stop to chat about neutral topics, the weather, the neighborhood, the progress of her roses. Gradually, their conversations deepened. Mrs. Chen told him about her son David, a surgeon at Royal Melbourne Hospital, and her daughter-in-law Sarah, who taught primary school. She showed him pictures of her grandchildren, teenagers now, fully Australian but proud of their Vietnamese heritage. Frank shared stories about Margaret, about his own battles with readjustment, about the slow process of learning to live with trauma instead of being consumed by it. The breakthrough came on a Sunday afternoon in July. Frank was struggling to prune his grapevine. Margaret had always handled the garden, and his attempts at horticulture were more enthusiastic than skilled. Mrs. Chen appeared at the fence with a pair of proper pruning shears and a patient smile. You're cutting too much, she said gently. The vine needs some of the old growth to support the new. Together they worked to restore Frank's damaged grapevine. Mrs. Chen's hands were sure and gentle, shaped by decades of coaxing life from difficult ground. As they worked, Frank found himself telling her about his recurring nightmares, about the faces that still visited him in the dark. After Duck died, Mrs. Chen said, carefully cutting away dead wood, I had nightmares every night for 2 years. In my dreams I could always save him. I could warn him about the mortars, make him take cover, change the ending. But every morning, I would wake up and he would still be dead. What stopped them? The nightmares, I mean. Mrs. Chen paused in her pruning. I realized that the dreams weren't about saving Duck. They were about punishing myself for surviving when he didn't. When I stopped trying to change the past and started honoring it instead, the dreams became gentler. How do you honor the past without drowning in it? Mrs. Chen gestured to the grapevine they were tending. Like this, you keep what was good and growing. You cut away what's dead and diseased. You make space for new growth while respecting the old roots. Frank looked at the vine, already healthier looking under Mrs. Chen's careful attention. I don't know how to do that. Start small, she said. Start with forgiveness. Not for the politicians or the generals or the people who made the war. Start with forgiving the young soldier you were, who did his best in an impossible situation. The real turning point came in August, on the anniversary of Vietnam's National Day. Frank was washing dishes when he saw David Chen's car pull into the driveway next door. Mrs. Chen's son emerged looking stressed and frustrated, followed by his wife Sarah and their 2 teenage children. Frank couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. This was a family argument, probably about Mrs. Chen's decision to maintain her Vietnamese traditions in an Australian household. Frank had seen similar conflicts play out among other immigrant families in the neighborhood. 20 minutes later, David Chen's car roared out of the driveway, leaving Mrs. Chen standing alone in her front garden with tears streaming down her face. Frank didn't hesitate. He walked over and stood beside her, not saying anything, just offering his presence. They think I'm too Vietnamese, Mrs. Chen said quietly. David wants me to move to a retirement home where I'll fit in better. He says I embarrass his children with my traditions, my accent, My stories about the war. Frank felt a familiar anger rising, not the old destructive rage he'd carried for decades, but a clean, protective fury on behalf of someone who'd become important to him. Your traditions are what kept you alive, Frank said. Your accent is proof of your courage. Your stories are the only thing that keeps your husband's memory alive. Mrs. Chen looked at him with surprise. I understand what it's like to have people want you to forget who you are because it makes them uncomfortable. I understand what it's like to carry stories that other people think are too difficult to hear. Frank paused, then made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Would you like me to talk to David? Not as a stranger, but as someone who served alongside men like your husband. Someone who understands what you've sacrificed. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. You would do that? Mrs. Chen, Lin, you've spent 50 years being told that your pain doesn't matter, that your story isn't worth telling. I've spent 50 years believing the same thing about myself. Maybe it's time we both stopped accepting that. David Chen was a successful surgeon. Frank could see it in his expensive car, his perfectly pressed clothes, his confident bearing. But when he answered Frank's knock on his door 3 days later, he looked like a man wrestling with guilt and frustration in equal measure. Dr. Chen, I'm Frank Morrison, your mother's neighbor. I was wondering if we could have a word. David's expression was wary but polite. If this is about the hedge, Mr. Morrison, I've already spoken to the council about the height restrictions. It's not about the hedge, it's about your mother's war stories. David's face tightened. Look, Mr. Morrison, I've already spoken to the council about the height restrictions. Morrison, I appreciate that Mum has found someone to talk to about the old days, but you have to understand, she gets confused sometimes. The stories change, get more dramatic. We've learned to take them with a grain of salt. Frank felt that familiar protective anger rise again, but he kept his voice level. Dr. Chen, what do you know about Firebase Alpha? I'm sorry? Firebase Alpha, near Duke Hoa, June 18, 19. Your father's last operation. David stared at Frank with sudden intensity. How do you know about that? Because I was there, not at Alpha specifically, but in the area, 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. We provided support for ARVN units like your father's. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder he'd spent 2 days preparing. Inside were photocopies of military records, operation reports, and newspaper clippings he'd retrieved from the Australian War Memorial Archives. Your father wasn't just any ARVN lieutenant, David. He was commanding a reconnaissance unit that provided intelligence for 3 successful operations against NVA supply lines. The Australian Army specifically mentioned his unit in their after-action reports. David took the folder with trembling hands, scanning documents that confirmed details he'd never heard before. Here, Frank pointed to a specific passage. Operation Hammer. Your father's intel allowed us to intercept a weapons shipment that would have killed dozens of Australian and American soldiers. The report specifically commends Lieutenant Duke Chen for exceptional courage and tactical acumen under enemy fire. David was quiet for a long moment, reading through records that painted a picture of his father as a skilled and respected officer, not the footnote to history he'd always imagined. She never told me any of this, David said finally, because she thought you wouldn't believe her, because she's spent 50 years being told that her memories are unreliable, that her pain doesn't matter, that her story isn't worth preserving. Frank leaned forward slightly. Your mother isn't confused, David. She's traumatized. There's a difference. And the stories she tells aren't getting more dramatic. They're getting more detailed because she finally has someone who understands the context. David closed the folder and looked at Frank with new eyes. You really served with him, with my father. Not directly, but our units operated in the same areas, fought the same enemies, lost friends to the same war. Your father and I were allies, David. We bled for the same cause. Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. Your mother has spent half a century in a country that barely acknowledges her sacrifice. She's watched her husband's war be forgotten, his service dismissed, his memory reduced to a footnote in someone else's tragedy. And now the only family she has left wants her to stop talking about the most important person in her life. David was crying now, quietly but openly. I didn't know. I thought she was making herself more important than she really was. She's not making herself important enough, Frank said firmly. Your mother is a war widow who survived 3 years in a prison camp, spent 2 years in refugee camps, and rebuilt her entire life in a foreign country. She raised a son who became a doctor, maintained her husband's memory for 46 years, and somehow managed to forgive the people who abandoned her. That's not someone who needs to be hidden away. That's someone who deserves to be celebrated. The reconciliation didn't happen overnight, but it happened. David began visiting his mother more regularly, asking questions he'd never thought to ask, listening to stories he'd dismissed for decades. He brought his children, Mrs. Chen's grandchildren, and taught them to listen too. Frank became a bridge between past and present, helping to translate not just Mrs. Chen's experiences, but their significance. He helped David understand that his mother's difficult memories weren't obstacles to overcome, but treasures to preserve. In September, Frank made a suggestion that surprised everyone, including himself. "I'd like to take your mother to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial," he told David. "Not the big one in Canberra, the local one here in Melbourne. I think she should see her husband's name among the honored dead." David looked confused, but Dad wasn't Australian. His name wouldn't be on an Australian memorial. Frank smiled. "You'd be surprised. The memorial includes ARVN officers who served alongside Australian forces. I've been doing some research." The trip to the memorial was emotional for all of them. Frank pushed Mrs. Chen's wheelchair. She'd insisted she was fine to walk, but Frank had noticed her increasing frailty, while David and his family followed behind. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Melbourne was smaller than its American cousin, but no less moving. Black granite panels listed the names of the 521 Australians who died in Vietnam, along with brief descriptions of their service. Frank guided Mrs. Chen to a section she'd never seen before, a panel dedicated to Allied forces, and there, etched in stone among other ARVN officers who'd served with distinction alongside Australian forces, was Lieutenant Duke Chen's name. Mrs. Chen reached out with a trembling finger to trace the letters of her husband's name. For 46 years, she'd carried his memory alone. Now finally, it was preserved in stone, acknowledged by the country she'd chosen as her home. "He's remembered," she whispered. "Someone remembered." Frank knelt beside her wheelchair. "He was never forgotten, Lynn. His sacrifice mattered. Your sacrifice mattered. You both served something bigger than yourselves." David was openly weeping now, reading the citation beneath his father's name that described the lieutenant's final action, leading a desperate defense of wounded Australian soldiers while his own position was being overrun. "I'm sorry, Mum," David said, kneeling on Mrs. Chen's other side. "I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I didn't understand." Mrs. Chen reached out to take her son's hand with one hand and Frank's with the other. "Understanding takes time," she said gently. "The important thing is that you're listening now." 6 months later, Frank Morrison stood in Mrs. Chen's kitchen, helping her prepare traditional Vietnamese tea for a gathering unlike any either of them had imagined possible. David and his family were coming for dinner, along with Sarah's parents and Frank's own daughter Emma, who'd driven down from Sydney specifically to meet the woman who'd become so important to her father. The kitchen smelled of ginger and star anise, unfamiliar spices that Frank had learned to associate with comfort and healing. Mrs. Chen moved around her domain with renewed energy, her face brighter than Frank had ever seen it. "Are you nervous?" Frank asked, arranging cups on a tray with the careful precision she'd taught him. "A little," Mrs. Chen admitted. "It's been a long time since I cooked for so many people, and I've never cooked for other Australians before. Besides you, I mean." Frank smiled. "They'll love it, and if they don't, it's their loss." The doorbell rang, and Frank watched Mrs. Chen smooth her hair and check her appearance one final time. At 71 she was still beautiful, but more than that she was finally at peace with who she was and where she belonged. The evening was a success beyond Frank's hopes. Mrs. Chen's grandchildren, initially shy about their grandmother's stories, found themselves fascinated by her accounts of Vietnam, her journey to Australia, her memories of their grandfather. David's daughter, 16-year-old Amy, spent the entire evening asking questions about Vietnamese culture and language. Emma, Frank's daughter, was enchanted by Mrs. Chen's grace and strength. As they said their goodbyes, she pulled Frank aside. "Dad, I haven't seen you this happy since Mum died. What's changed?" Frank looked across the room to where Mrs. Chen was hugging David's youngest son, speaking to him in Vietnamese while he giggled at the unfamiliar sounds. "I learned something I should have figured out 50 years ago," Frank said. "The people we were taught to see as enemies were just people fighting for the same things we were. Home, family, freedom, peace. The real enemy was the war itself." Emma smiled. "And it only took you 8 decades to figure that out. Some lessons are worth waiting for." As Frank walked Mrs. Chen's guests to their cars, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 old survivors of a forgotten war, separated by language and nationality and decades of pain, had somehow found their way to friendship and healing. The war in Vietnam had ended in 1975, but for Frank Morrison and Lynn Chen, peace had taken almost 50 years longer to arrive. Some wounds needed time to heal. Some enemies needed to become friends. Some stories needed to be told and retold until they became bridges instead of walls. Standing in Mrs. Chen's front garden under the Melbourne stars, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than his own pain. The war was finally over, not because the shooting had stopped, but because two people who'd been taught to hate each other had chosen love instead. Some victories take a lifetime to achieve, but they're worth the wait.